CCDP Spotlight Podcast, Season 2.
Welcome to the CCDP Spotlight.
Welcome to the CCDP podcast et bienvenue au podcast du CCDP.
This is the podcast for the Center on Conflict, Development and Peacebuilding,
From the Geneva Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies,
where research meets practice in addressing some of the world's most pressing challenges.
The CCDP is the Graduate Institute's focal point for research in the areas of conflict analysis, peacebuilding,
and the complex relationship between security and development.
I'm Jennifer Thornquist, a research assistant and the podcast producer here at the center we call the CCDP. We believe ideas matter, but so does making them accessible. In this show, you'll hear from scholars, practitioners, students in engaging, clear conversations. Plus, each episode features Field Notes Live, where we'll ask the CCDP team to share insights on the ideas and questions shaping their work today. Here's a preview of today's episode.
Andrew Gilmour, head of the Berghof Foundation.
This is your host today, Robert Watkins, and I have as my guest Andrew Gilmour.
I was quite a young man when I joined the UN. By coincidence, it was the week that the wall came down in Berlin, and I headed off to Afghanistan back in 1989.
Andrew has been executive director of the Berghof Foundation since May 2020, and he's coming to us today online from the foundation's headquarters in Berlin. Before joining the Berghof Foundation, Andrew served 30 years at the United Nations, most recently as UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, and before that as Director for Political, Peacekeeping, Humanitarian, and Human Rights Affairs in the Executive Office of the Secretary General. Welcome, Andrew. You, going over your past, it's clear you've had a very interesting career journey from political to human rights, and now to managing a major foundation dedicated to mediation and peace building, and all the while being someone concerned about the environment. Could you just tell our listeners more about this career journey?
I go back quite a long way on a number of issues. For example, I joined WWF, the Great Environmentalist Organization, at the age of 10, and Amnesty International at the age of 15. But actually, I spent essentially the next 40 years thinking that these were very much separate interests. Human rights and the environment were not were like music or history, just separate interests. And it was only in my final position at the UN that I realized quite how integrally linked human rights and climate change are. And indeed, since I spent most of my UN career working on conflict and in conflict zones, and now running an organization that focuses solely on conflict, the links between that are also ever clearer.
Well, certainly human rights issues are cross-cutting issues, and you could say human rights are involved in just about anything that we do. But Berghof is an organization dedicated to peace building and conflict resolution around the world. And I noticed in the last strategy document, I know you're working on a new one, but in the current one, Berghof decided to focus on a number of additional thematic areas, and climate change was one of the new areas that the organization was going to work on, including dealing with the past in conflict transformation and the impact of the digital revolution. Climate change doesn't seem to be the kind of subject that someone with your background in political and conflict would normally get involved with. Yet you've recently written a book entitled The Burning Question, Climate and Conflict, Why Does It Matter? I think it'd be really interesting if you could say a few words about this book and how you see this relationship between climate and conflict and what needs to be done about it.
Yes, well, thank you. It is actually the first book, and it was published last year, the first book ever written on this subject. But I have absolutely no doubt that it is certainly not going to be the last book, because the links between climate and conflict are ever greater, it seems to me. And I'd started seeing this in my sort of final years in the UN, particularly in many of the countries that we were working in, whether it was in the Sahel or Iraq or Syria, that I realized, and obviously I wasn't the only person realizing it, so it's not a tremendous discovery on my part, that many conflicts are made that much more serious and that much more complicated as a result of climate change. Now, I'm not saying there's an absolutely clear link between climate and between the rise. And indeed, one could say that in the first 1 degree rise of temperature globally, there hasn't been a sort of a clear link in the rise of conflict. But that does not mean that the second degree, and we are well into that second degree now, will not have a vastly greater. I mean, maybe I would just give you sort of like one example. I was in Iraq from 2007 to 2009. What I didn't know at that time was that we were, yeah, sure, I knew we were in a drought, but I didn't know that it was literally the worst drought since the sort of the Fertile Crescent of 3,000 years ago. It was, and it lasted 7 years. And what this had the effect of doing was driving people who may have been already dissatisfied. I'm talking particularly Sunni farmers in both Syria and Iraq who had very major sources of disagreement with their government, who they felt were repressing them in various different ways. But climate change made it worse. The terrible dust storms, the desertification, the fact that farmlands that had been fertile for centuries are now completely unusable, meant that entire communities were forced to basically up sticks and move to the suburbs of very poor cities where they became more radicalized. And as I said, there's very little doubt in my mind that this was a contributory factor in the devastating rise of the Islamic State in both Iraq and Syria in about 2014. As I said, it was not the main cause of trouble, but it was certainly a contributory cause. And you can say the same thing about Somalia, you can say it about Mali, and many other countries, even Afghanistan, actually. There are clear drivers of conflict that come from the fact that life is even harder, that competition is even stiffer when it comes to natural resources such as water and fertile land. And I think this is going to increase, and it will have huge impacts on migration as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty widely accepted that climate change is an important factor in causing conflicts. But don't you think that's kind of missing the point in the sense that it's widely accepted that it's really access to resources and the unequal distribution of resources that is probably one of the biggest drivers of violent conflict. So isn't it really the struggle over the control over those resources which is at the basis of the many conflicts? In Yemen, for instance, because of the reduction in aquifers, nomadic cattle, arguments in South Sudan, herders versus sedentary farmers in the Sahel, even in the western part of the United States, where cattle ranchers are always in conflict with people who want to use the land for agriculture. So my question really is it really the climate change that is the cause of that, or is it the unequal distribution of resources or the lack of access to resources that is the driver of conflict?
Robert, I would say it's not an either-or question. It is clearly both. Historically, of course, long before we had anthropogenic climate change, there were conflicts over natural resources, and they will continue. My point is, though, that those conflicts become even more tense as a result of climate change because there are less resources to go around. And even we're talking about areas, whether it's in the areas around Boko Haram, where they operate in northern Nigeria and Cameroon, whether it is Al-Qaeda in Yemen, whether it is Al-Shabaab in Somalia, all of these places are countries that are disproportionately affected by climate change, where there is a desperate desire, even more desperate than there has been historically, for fertile land and for water. And this is yet another driver of conflict, and one that, as climate change becomes ever more intense, so will conflict become ever more intense.
Mm-hmm. You've sounded in your book very optimistic about the level of engagement of young people, particularly as it concerns environmental issues and climate change. Is there a special reason why you believe young people are so passionate about the subject? And what do you think can be done to ensure that their involvement is more than just an emotional one?
Well, I think obviously young people, by definition, have more of their lives ahead of them than the rest of us. And therefore, they have more at stake in ensuring that our generation leaves behind a less devastated and unhealthy planet than is currently we're online to do. I've said that about young people over many years, both in my job on human rights, but also when it comes to climate change. I mean, there is now, let's face it, a major pushback, and a number of young people, perhaps not so idealistic, and perhaps more, and with the election of Trump and with the rise of right-wing movements. And in Israel too, you find that young people are often more right-wing and hardline on many issues than their parents. So I may not be quite as optimistic about young people and their attitude, their sort of can-do attitude, their absolutely determination to ensure that there is climate action. Of course, there are millions of young people who are equally committed as they were a few years ago, but some others are perhaps a little bit less. And the power of social media is clearly instrumental in that.
Yeah, and you mentioned the rise of the right in the West and a number of other countries. Mentioned Israel, and many amongst them seem to be climate change deniers. And I'm not sure that that's really the issue that they're most concerned about, though. I think it's mostly anti-immigrant. At least they're using anti-immigrant policies as a kind of wedge to cause or to gain attraction with their base. How do you see that evolving with now today, a very important day in the United States with the inauguration of President Trump, who has himself also been a very important climate change denier, but he's just one part of a much wider movement in the West that questions not only climate change, but a lot of other shibboleths within what has been in the liberal post-World War II order. Do you think that is going to have a negative effect on how seriously climate change is taken, and the fact that it is a major contributing factor towards conflict?
Yes, I think I do actually. About 4 days ago, I gave a lecture to the Pentagon to a large number of people there, and I said that of all the many things in the world that perplex me, and of course there are very many that do, the one that perhaps perplexes me more than anything else is this: no matter how serious and devastating the forest fires are in the United States, no matter how devastating floods, no matter how devastating droughts, no matter how devastating rising seas or extinction or anything else, however bad the event, I used to start thinking, I mean, like many people, well, what a terrible tragedy, but at least it will help the American people wake up to the realities of climate change and what we're doing, and hopefully they will do something before it's too late. And yet it seems nothing, literally nothing, nudges the dial of US public opinion, and as we've seen, the majority of voters voted for somebody who's explicitly said climate change is a hoax.
Field Notes Live is a mid-episode segment, person on the street style, interviews, timely topics, where we bring you the voices from the field, or in this case, just returning. I'm Jennifer Thornquist, and in this short episode, I sit down with Bilal Salameh. He's a postdoc researcher at the CCDP.
So yeah, I born in Syria, and I did my thesis, my master thesis actually, and also my PhD on Syria and the dynamic of conflict and political order formation in Syria.
Recently, Bilal returned to Damascus, the place of his PhD research, to find the city both familiar and changed. It's a conversation about memory and the future of Syria beyond the headlines. Here's our discussion.
But after I left Syria in 2011, I didn't go back and couldn't go back to the area under the Syrian regime or government control. I mean here Damascus, the capital, and the rest of the cities, including the city where I came from. So after the collapse of the regime, I had the chance to go back. During my field work, I got the chance to go to northern Syria, northern part of Syria, which were the areas which were outside of the state control, more under the rebel control. So for me was a return to Syria, if I may say, and I had this chance of right to return to Syria. I still have my relatives there, my friends, of course, my grandma. So it was nice at a personal level, but also it was important at professional and for academic and research goals.
Next, I asked Bilal how he found the state of Syria upon his arrival.
Well, the collapse of the Assad regime was quick and came as a surprise for many. For even the internal actors, I mean the local actors themselves, the regional and the international actors. And a surprise also for the analysts and people who were following Syria. So there were sort of combination of different feelings, even among the people who were in Syria as well. There is a hope and there are many concerns.
Bilal first discussed the history of Syria and why the fall of the Assad regime is creating such a space of hope right now.
Here we need to keep in mind that the Syrian regime, former Syrian regime, controlled Syria for more than 5 decades. So since 1970 until 2024, and even from mid-60s, we cannot speak about sort of free election or political life. So I think even since mid-50s. So for Syrians, just to get rid of this domination was very important as an opportunity for a new Syria and a new hope. And that gave many people on the ground this sense of empowerment. And this is a thing that I felt when I went back to Syria. Many people are empowered again. NGOs, many activists, many politicians are empowered and want to take a part of building this new forming Syria.
Bilal's current work focuses on state building, security sector reform, and the shifting dynamics of UN peace missions in an emerging multipolar world. But again, during this conversation, he stepped away from that and into his lived experience. Here's what he had to say when I asked him if he was able to visit with any family on his trip.
It was, of course, an emotional moment for me to go back to Syria. And for many as well with me, like when I was in the airplane with other Syrians who were going back. So we went to Lebanon, and from Lebanon we crossed to Syria, because at that time, still the main airport in Damascus was still not functioning. I had a friend who I met in the airplane. I didn't meet him since 2015, so that was also a surprise. And he was going back to see his relatives and his family in Syria. And he was telling me that I wish really that no one will wake me up when I arrive to the border and tell me this is a dream. Because the collapse of the Syrian regime was really a dream. It happened only in just 2 weeks. So it was, of course, a bit of a really emotional moment for me. And especially when I went back and met my cousins, my uncles, my grandma. Of course, I felt so happy because she was also so happy to see me after that 13 years. My aunt as well. And I didn't tell her, so I just knocked the door after 13 years.
You surprised her?
Well, I didn't want to do that, but when I went to the city of Homs, where she lives at that time, there was a security operation happening in that neighborhood. So they cut off all the mobile phones connections, etc., the internet. So I tried to reach out to her for 2 days before, but I couldn't. So I just knocked the door, and it was, of course, an emotional crash.
Building on his expertise in studying the conflicts in Syria, I asked Bilal if he had any analysis to share with listeners. I also asked him what brought him hope. Enjoy the rest of our conversation.
The possibility of change. I mean, the possibility of change. And again, I will go back to Syria to give this example. If you ask, I would say all the analysts or people who were following Syria and researchers, they would not give you any possibility of the scenario that the Syrian regime was going to collapse and we will have a free Syria again. But that happened all of a sudden, and no one was expecting that. So this possibility that every scenario can be possible give me the hope of possibility of change and the possibility of having better future.
To hear the rest of our conversation, be sure to check out the Field Notes Live episode posted below. Now back to today's episode.
I talked about one of the other areas that Berghof is becoming involved in, which I personally find very interesting because I'm a historian by study and by interest. And as I mentioned earlier, dealing with the past is a new part of the strategy. And you were quoted at the Berlin Moot as saying, how to handle the past is an important part of conflict resolution. I know David Fromkin in his 1989 classic book, A Peace to End All Peace, argues that the current problems in the Middle East, for instance, date back to the breakup of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. And I'm wondering, does it go even beyond that? I mean, how far back in the past do you think we really need to be looking to understand conflicts up to date?
Well, Robert, what we have in common is that you and I have both spent a lot of our lives working on conflict issues, and that we are historians by training. And I found this an absolutely fascinating factor. I, particularly in some of the places I was based in, and I would say Exhibit A and Exhibit B are, I would say, Jerusalem and the former Yugoslavia is where history is the actual, frankly, the main cause of the dispute. It is contrasting historical narratives, and it is that and more confined to other places, and obviously Jerusalem goes back millennia. In the case of the Balkans, the famous date is 1389, where the Serbs got defeated by the Ottomans in Kosovo, across the field of Kosovo-Polje in 1389. And it is remarkable, and I served there 15 years ago, that even then, and that's a good 20 years after the terrible wars of the former Yugoslavia in the 90s. But I was struck by how often Serbs talk about 1389 still. And their whole view of the world is a set of historical narratives which has some truth in it and a lot of untruths, as everybody's historical narrative does. And of course, the dispute over who are the real owners of Jerusalem is an even deadlier dispute, in fact. And I found that in many other places. I found that in Iraq, for example. There's a very important province and city, both with the name of Kirkuk, which have three communities in them, the Arabs, the Kurds, and the Turkmen. And I spoke to senior members of all three repeatedly, and they all gave a view of history which was very, very similar. It's just changing the name. It's basically, look, this is our place, and the other two guys came here just afterwards, but this is ours. And they all have this narrative. And I would hope that there are ways, but they have been so experimented with, to try to use history books, to use museums in a constructive way. There are potentially really important ways of dealing with the past in a way that you can sit people down and exchange stories in ways that actually lead to greater understanding, rather than getting people just to dig into their own historical narrative and repeating it ad nauseam.
Yeah. One of my previous guests, in fact, said that 90% of today's conflicts can be attributed to one or a mixture of three factors: the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the process of decolonization that began in the 1960s, which is interesting.
Absolutely the case, yeah.
Finally, Andrew, could you let us know what has been perhaps the most challenging part of this job that you've been in for some almost 5 years now, in managing the Berghof Foundation? Or if not the most challenging, the most satisfying experience that you've had?
It has been satisfying to bring together people from other disciplines and together. So people who may not be automatically associated with conflict. And by then I mean bring the business sector, or bringing neuroscientists, or bringing climate experts, or human rights people. I'm very keen in our field, Robert, to slightly reduce the almost innate tensions between the human rights community and the mediation community. They both see each other in a bad light. Of course, they're both in a way seeking the same thing, but with a different emphasis. And which is why the human rights people can often feel that the mediators are too cynical and maybe not compassionate enough, or not principled enough, and are ready to do bad deals in order to stop the violence. Conversely, the the mediation people can look at human rights people as being a little bit too moralistic and maybe not politically savvy enough to realize that actually you do have to occasionally talk to people with a lot of blood on their hands in order to reduce peace. So what I've been trying to do, and I do get satisfaction out of that, is to try and whittle away having worked on both fields, by the way, I'm very aware that, and perhaps been guilty myself in the past of buying into the caricature that each side has of the other, and trying to do a little bit less of that is something that I've considered very important.
It's interesting. There are more and more mediation being undertaken by humanitarian actors these days because of the failure of political actors to do it. Listen, thank you very much, Andrew. We're going to have to end it there.
Thank you so much.
That's it for today's Spotlight podcast with our guest, Andrew Gilmour. Be sure to sign up on your podcast platform for notifications on future podcasts from CCDP or to listen to previous episodes that you may have missed. This is Robert Watkins and producer Jennifer Thornquist inviting you to tune in to our next Spotlight podcast.
CCDP Spotlight Podcast Season 2. Shining a light on bridging research and practice.